the OG fact checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. I don't know about you guys, but for me, March zipped by a little too quickly for my taste. I had some family business to take care of, and I thought I had enough time to finish the script for this episode. But then I took a good look at the calendar and went, yikes! April is almost here. And if April is almost here, that means Women's History Month is coming to a close. No matter. I don't need a special month to cover the ladies, do I? In my previous episode, episode 27, They Crawled So We Could Walk, I told the story of the Tuskegee women and how Black women had faced discrimination during World War I when they tried to join as nurses. A small number of Black women were allowed to serve as Army Corps nurses for 8 months before being discharged and blocked from joining the military until World War II. I know I gave an abysmal picture of how Black women were blocked from flying for the Wasps, the first all-female flying squadron. But I said to rest easy because Black women did get the opportunity to be a first in the military, not only as Tuskegee women, but also as waves for the U.S. Navy and as SPARS for the U.S. Coast Guard. However, the manner in which Black women got that opportunity wasn't as dramatic as Black activist A. Philip Randolph standing on business with President Roosevelt, but it was dramatic. Let's just say it literally took something that resembled divine intervention for Black women to join the military during World War II, which is why the title of this episode is It Took an Act of God to Change the Tide. All right, for those who are new to this channel, I will recap what I've covered in previous episodes on women in the military during World War II, like episode 23 on the 6 Native American women from Oklahoma who served on the Sooner Squadron, or episode 27 on the Tuskegee women and the Wasps, the all-female flying squadron. Between 1941 and 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt ramped up the World War II war effort by tapping any resource that could be used. He signed Executive Order 8929 that mandated the transfer of the Coast Guard to the Department of the Navy, essentially putting everyone in the Coast Guard on active duty, which added 231,000 men to the ranks that were mostly sent overseas. The passage of EO 8929 created an interesting effect. With the men overseas, people were needed to take the place stateside, and that's when women were tapped on the shoulder. Now, here is where I need to make a few corrections and clarifications on what I previously reported. 3 pieces of legislation passed in 1942 were responsible for giving women the chance to serve during World War II. The first one was Public Law 689 of the 77th Congress, second session, signed in July 1942, which amended the Naval Reserve Act of 1938 and sent the menfolk out to sea to be replaced with women on shore. Out of this law, 2 women's reserves were created, the Waves and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. The messed up part about that law is that if any of the Waves or Marine reservists became disabled, incurred a disease, or died while on active duty, the death and disability benefits the women or their descendants would receive would reflect laws related to civil service employees, not the military. The second law was Public Law 773, signed in November 1942, which amended the Coast Guard Auxiliary and Reserve Act of 1941 by declaring the same thing that was declared for Public Law 689. The men would go out to sea and the women would take their place on shore. Out of Public Law 773 came the U.S. Coast Guard SPARS, an acronym that reflects the Coast Guard's motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. The third law was the Civilian Pilot Training Act of 1939, which was responsible for the creation of the WASPs. It's no secret that the Army and Navy were segregated and discriminatory, and it took Black activists like A. Philip Randolph and the NAACP to strong arm President Roosevelt to enact Executive Order 8802 in June 1941, which theoretically was supposed to ban the discrimination that barred Black people from working for the government or defense contractors. Now, here's the rub. In the military, EO 8802 meant absolutely nothing. I stated in episode 26 on John Coltrane that only Black men could only serve as mess stewards in the Navy. But the only reason Black men got those jobs was because those jobs were previously held by Filipinos. Japan had invaded and occupied the Philippines by the time the U.S. jumped into World War II, so any use of Filipinos was a no-go because of obvious trust issues. Black activists that included Adam Clayton Powell were pushing for Black men to be more than just mess attendants and for more Black women to join the military in the same roles white women held. Let's just say there were a lot of small skirmishes being fought in the larger battle to, oh, wait a second, it almost sounds like activists were pushing for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the military. Some skirmishes were won, like the first Black Navy B-1 band, the 500 Black women who served in the Army Nurse Corps, and the Tuskegee Airmen and women. But the roadblocks were still there. What I find amazing is how hard these activists and their allies had to fight just to get a little bit of high ground. But their persistence led to a whole lot of talk in Washington about what other jobs Black men could do. Maybe the Navy B-1 bands can serve on battleships and play music to improve race relations, or maybe they can be sent to naval shore posts in the Caribbean. No, 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 said the powers that be in Washington, specifically Secretary of the Navy, William Franklin Knox. Knox was a Boston-born newspaper owner and publisher who had served with President Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. A Republican and former vice presidential nominee, he was tapped by Franklin Roosevelt for Secretary of the Navy in 1940. The odd thing about Knox is that he's credited with expanding the Navy into a force capable of fighting in both the Atlantic and Pacific, and is recognized for his administrative talents and good judgment, which made invaluable contributions. What makes this odd is that Knox was dead set against any kind of integration, and he wasn't the only one when you look at the overall enlistment numbers of Blacks versus whites in all branches of service during World War II. He believed forcing white men to work alongside Black men would decrease morale, which in turn would decrease productivity and might even start race riots. As far as he was concerned, when at sea, Black men could best serve the Navy as mess attendants and nothing more. By February 1943, more than 2/3 of the 26,909 African American sailors were messmen. And when the Waves was established in July 1942, Knox said yes to white women for reserve duty and no to Black women, offering no specific reason as to why they couldn't be admitted. You can see the contradiction, can't you? Knox is credited with expanding the Navy, yet he went out of his way to block thousands of Black women and men. However, he did approve the admittance of 16 Black enlisted men into the Navy Officer Training Course in January 1944, a group that was known as the Golden 13. Child, That is a whole other story that I will cover in a future episode. And then an act of God, coupled with stress, heredity, and bad eating habits, changed the tide for Black women. In April 1944, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had a heart attack and died. And all the Black activists started cracking their knuckles. And they were like, "We glad you dead, you rascal, you." They put pressure on President Roosevelt because he was running for his third term in office. And bam, Black women were admitted and integrated into the Waves and SPARS, a move that was supported by the man who took Knox's place, James Forrestal, who had been a secret ally all along. The floodgates were now open. A major barrier was removed. But out of the 90,000 women who served in the Waves, only 72 were Black. And of the 11,000 women who volunteered for SPARS, only 5 were Black. If I were to view those numbers through a glass of half empty, half full philosophy, I would choose the half full glass perspective. Why? Because small numbers are better than no numbers at all. Now I'm going to give you some background on the 2 women who were the first female officers and the first to lead the Waves and the SPARS, Captain Mildred Helen McAfee and Lieutenant Commander Dorothy Stratton, respectively. Captain Mildred McAfee, born in May 1900 in Park College, Missouri, was an alumna of Vassar College and held a Master of Arts degree from the University of Chicago. She taught at all girls elementary and middle schools in Missouri before taking a teaching position at Tusculum College in Tennessee. After earning her master's in sociology, she was hired as Dean of Women at Centre College, then returned to Vassar to serve as Executive Secretary of the Associate Alumnae. She was the president of Wellesley College when she took a leave of absence to become the Navy's first commissioned officer with the rank of lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve in August 1942. She took on the daunting position of director of the Waves, and a little over a year later, she was promoted to captain. McAfee is credited with developing the Waves into a force of 80,000 women who served in various rates. She died in 1994 at the age of 94. The SPARS needed a leader, and Lieutenant Commander Dorothy Stratton was tapped to be director. Born in March 1899 in Brookfield, Missouri, Stratton earned a Bachelor of Arts degree and traveled out west to eventually become a high school teacher in the state of Washington before working as a vice principal at a high school in California in 1923. The following year, she earned a master's degree in psychology, then earned a PhD in student personnel administration from Columbia University in 1933. Shortly thereafter, she became an associate professor in psychology at Purdue University, eventually becoming Dean of Women. She served on the selection board for the Army for the first group of Women's Auxiliary Corps, or WACs, in June 1942, before taking a leave of absence from Purdue to join the Waves as a senior lieutenant. After completing her officer's training at Smith College, she was assigned to the U.S. Naval Training Station in Madison, Wisconsin. When Congress gave the green light for the SPARS, Dorothy Stratton was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned to the Coast Guard, becoming the first female officer accepted for duty in the history of the service. 2 years later, she was advanced to commander and then to the rank of captain 1 month later. She was instrumental in creating the policies for SPAR procurement, training, assignment, and morale, which led to the recruitment of about 10,000 enlisted and 1,000 commissioned officers for SPARS. Relieved of duty in January 1946, Stratton worked numerous federal service positions related to the military, ending her career as National Executive Director for the Girl Scouts of America. She died in 2006 at the age of 107. Now that I've gotten McAfee and Stratton's stories out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to the first Black women to be inducted into the Waves and SPARS. For the Waves, the first two Black women chosen to attend the Naval Reserve Midshipman School in Northampton, Massachusetts, to become commissioned officers were Harriet Pickens and Frances Wills. Pickens, born in 1909 in Talladega, Alabama, and Wills, born in 1910 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, were educated women with impressive resumes. Pickens received her bachelor's degree from Smith College and was the executive secretary for the Harlem Tuberculosis and Health Committee. Wills had 2 college degrees from Hunter College and the University of Pittsburgh and was a New York City social worker. When Pickens and Wills arrived at Midshipman School at Pickens' alma mater, Smith College, they were 3 weeks behind the others, so they spent the remaining 5 weeks of training playing catch-up. They learned basics such as plane and ship recognition and signal communications. They did catch up, and on December 26, 1944, Harriet Pickens and Frances Wills made history as the first 2 Black women to become U.S. Navy commissioned officers. The 2 were assigned to the enlisted Waves training facility at Wills' alma mater, Hunter College. When the war ended, both women returned to their work prior to their enlistment. Pickens continued her work through the Harlem Tuberculosis and Health Committee. She passed away in 1970 at the age of 60. Wills returned to her social work and being secretary to Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes. She wrote a book about her experience in the Waves titled Navy Blue and Other Colors, a memoir of adventures and happiness. She passed away from breast cancer in 1998 at the age of 88. I do have another Black first to share. The first Black woman to enlist in the regular Navy and to eventually achieve the rank of Chief Petty Officer was Edna Young. The only thing I could find on her was that she died in 2012, but I'm hoping time will reveal some information I can report in the future. For the SPARS, the first and only Black women to serve were Dorothy Winifred Byrd, Julia Watson Mosley Shields, Olivia Juliet Hooker, Aileen Anita Cook Moore, and Yvonne Cumberbatch. Of these 5 women, there is only information about one, Olivia Hooker from Columbus, Ohio. Hooker, who would become Dr. Olivia Hooker, was born in February 1915 in Muskogee, Oklahoma. As a child, she witnessed the destruction of her father's business during the Tulsa race riot of 1921 in the Greenwood neighborhood, what was also called Black Wall Street by Booker T. Washington. Greenwood was one of the most prosperous all-Black towns in America at the time. If you remember from episode 23 titled The Sooner Rather Than Later Squadron, I told the story of how the 5 civilized tribes who were slave owners were expelled from the Southeast and forced to travel west to Oklahoma for resettlement in the Indian Territory, and that event was called the Trail of Tears. But that wasn't the only way Blacks wound up in Oklahoma. Thousands of Blacks migrated from the South to Oklahoma after the Civil War and settled there and founded all-Black towns that included Boley, Clearview, Tatum, Lima, and Langston. As a matter of fact, Blacks claimed land during the 1889 land run and bought property to set up businesses. They established car repair shops, movie theaters, hotels, pool rooms, barbershops, schools, funeral homes, churches, law offices, medical and dental offices, even two newspapers. And white settlers who were flooding the area in droves were patrons of some of these Black owned businesses in Greenwood. You can pretty much guess that all this Black success was irritating for white folks, right? You know they were plotting to do something about it, right? The Ku Klux Klan started to grow in number, and they were scheming on how to sabotage all this prosperity, not only for Black people, but for Native Americans as well. Forms of domestic terrorism included lynchings, burnings, and castrations. Pictures of these acts were circulated on postcards. In May 1921, an incident between 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a Black man, and an unnamed white woman on an elevator was the spark that lit the powder keg. Rowland was arrested for allegedly grabbing the arm of the white woman and making her scream. Things began to escalate outside of the courthouse where Rowland was held. A large mob of angry whites were ready to charge the courthouse and drag Rowland out. Two groups of Black men with rifles and pistols showed up for protection, but the sheriff turned them away. The second time they were turned away is when things got crack-a-lackin'. It was total bedlam after that point. Angry whites stole ammunition and went absolutely apeshit all over Greenwood. They killed, looted, stole, set homes on fire, tied Black people to cars, and dragged them through the streets. They even managed to drop bombs made out of turpentine from planes. Basically, any kind of evil you can imagine was perpetrated that night in Greenwood with zero restraint. Blacks fought back as best they could until they exhausted their ammunition. By the next day, Greenwood was no more. Over 1,200 homes were burned down, 400 homes were looted, and about 100 to 300 people died, not to mention the hospitals, grocery stores, churches, and other businesses that were gone forever. Thousands were left homeless. One of the business owners affected by the slaughter was Olivia Hooker's father. And whereas some Blacks left and eventually returned, Hooker's father, like many others, didn't. He moved his family first to Topeka, Kansas, then to Columbus, Ohio. Hooker became a teacher, earning a bachelor's in education from the Ohio State University. When Olivia Hooker was 29 years old, she decided she wanted to do her part for the war effort. She had applied twice to the Waves, but was rejected for reasons not specified. So, she decided to join the SPARS in 1945 and was sworn in as enlisted a month before her 30th birthday. She trained for 6 weeks before reporting for her first duty station in Boston, where she served as a yeoman until 1946 when the SPARS were disbanded. She used her GI Bill to obtain a master's degree in psychological services from Columbia University, then earned a PhD in psychology at the University of Rochester, focusing on developing techniques that could motivate children with Down syndrome to complete difficult tasks. She was a faculty member at Fordham University in 1963 until her retirement in 1985. But she continued her advocacy for those with learning disabilities and for more minorities to enter the psychology field. Dr. Hooker passed away in 2018 at the age of 103. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.